Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for attending our third webinar in our GDPR series. My name is Geert Beekmans and I will today, together with Laurent de Surgelose, lead lawyer with DLA Piper, present you a bit more on the third topic in the series of webinars that we have constructed, and that is with regard to completing the data register, which is a new obligation under GDPR that didn't exist before, and on which we have received quite a few questions on how to do that, what to include, and so therefore we have chosen this topic to give you a bit more detail on that one. During the webinar, you can ask questions using the box on the right-hand side of your screen. And we will be answering the questions towards the end of the webinar, so don't hesitate to already, during the webinar, put questions in there. We would also like to encourage you to use the hashtag GDPR Countdown and the handle at SDWorx on Twitter to give feedback. If you have any further questions, you can also contact us on weareglobal@sdworx.com. On this level, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email. The presentation and our GDPR international report are also still available for download. And we will put after the webinar also a template for a data registry available on the site for download. You will also have the opportunity to rate this webinar at the end, which will certainly help us in improving the upcoming sessions, so please don't hesitate to provide us with your feedback. Laurent, to start with, I think let's start off then with the data registry and the reasons for implementing this new measure within GDPR.
Thank you, Geert. Indeed, let's start. Okay, the data register, it's all about the principle of accountability. And because you can't protect what you don't know you have. So most of you probably know that under the previous system, well, in fact, it's still applicable until May, you had an obligation under the directive to notify the Data Privacy Commission when you were processing data. There were also some exemptions, like, for example, for processing data in the framework of personnel administration. But besides that, you had the obligation, a prior obligation, to notify them. Most of the time you had an online register that you could complete with certain information. Now, the problem with that obligation is that it was not much complied with in fact, and that even when it was complied with, it was publicly available, but it was quite, well, nothing was done with it, or not much. So in the framework of the GDPR, and there is a new obligation that, in fact, will replace this previous one that had not really much impact. And the new obligation is, well, you will have to maintain a record of the processing activities, and that's something that is foreseen in Article 13 of the GDPR. Now, when I say you will have to keep and maintain all the processing activities that you are doing, by meaning you, I mean each controller and each processor. As you know, probably the controller is the entity or organization that determines the means and the purposes of the processing. Now, of course, when you have a rule, the first question that you ask yourself is are there any exemptions? And indeed, there is an exemption in GDPR for certain types of companies, more specifically small or medium organizations slash legal entities or enterprises with fewer than 250 people. Now, the exemption will not apply when your processing is likely to have some a risk to the rights and the freedoms of the data subject, maybe something sensitive, or maybe because there is a risk that you can lose these data. Well, then it triggers the obligation. Another one, and this one is a quite important one because it's said when the processing is not occasional. Well, of course, all companies, of almost all companies, they process data that relates to when you have employees, for example, to your employees. And if you process data of your employees, that's something that is, will trigger immediately the obligation to keep a register. So in a certain sense, this exemption is an exemption that will not really apply much. So, and you see also that the Data Privacy Commission in Belgium, in their recommendation of last year, said that all companies should have a register because the exemptions of the GDPR will rarely apply. So in fact, you could say it's a fake exemption that was foreseen in GDPR. Another exemption is also, but that's something that is of course recurrent, is that when you're processing what we call sensitive data, meaning can be medical data or ethnic origin, union affiliation, things like that, and specifically everything that relates to criminal convictions or offenses. These all fall under the obligation to maintain a register and to foresee these information about the processing in your data register. Now, overall, if you look at these new obligations, there are some first points of attention to note. Contrary to the old system, the data register is not publicly available anymore. So it's an internal tool that you will use. And again, like I said in the beginning, primary purpose of it is relates to the accountability principle. Because of course, when you deal with data, personal data, and we deal more and more with personal data, you need to know what you're doing with the data. You need to know what kind of data that you are dealing with and to whom you are sending this data, how you protect this data, what is the purpose of dealing with this data. And that's why there is this data register. This will give you the possibility to have a good understanding of what you're doing with the data. And that means that you as controller / processor, you're accountable for that, and that the data privacy authority / commission, well, they can ask you, well, give us an example of your register. So they from their side, they can fulfill their obligation, their new obligation, to see whether you comply with the law, and if need be, to sanction you if you don't. That's one of the first points of attention, and one of the changes with regard to the previous one. It applies to, like I said in the beginning, to controllers and also processors. So both will have the obligation, the legal obligation, to maintain the records and to have a register. Quite important also, especially if you to make your life easier, you intend to use some information that you already provided the Data Privacy Commission with in the framework of the previous obligation. Don't forget that the previous exemptions, like I said, for example, personal administration, doesn't apply anymore. So these data will need to be mentioned in in one of the categories, but Geert will discuss that more in detail. So the information that was not mentioned under the previous one will have to be mentioned in the register that you will need to adopt with the new obligation. And then, like I said, see it as an obligation for all of you because this exemption for small companies or middle-sized companies really an illusion because everybody is processing data for if you have employees. So in a certain sense, see it as an obligation. The obligation is immediately triggered in a certain sense. And even the Data Privacy Commission says that it's recommended that everybody has a register, which in the end is a useful tool. Now, another thing that you will need to take into account is that we use certain terms, and the GDPR uses certain terms. So we have record of processing activities, but of course, companies can already have all kinds of system, but using another name. It can be data inventory, software register, like you see on the slides, data index, personal data mapping, or the German wording I will not use. It's too complicated. Processing register, etc. I mean, all these things, well, it's in fact processing, record of processing activities, so it can be useful to make your life easier. Maybe you already have such sort of a register without, well, naming it a register, but maybe it's a kind of register, and you just need to look then what you are doing now and just adapt it to the specific legal obligations and the data that is foreseen in GDPR. But that would be already a useful tool for you to look inside your company. Well, maybe we have something, maybe we use something, we just give it the child another name. We can start working on that and adapt it to the new regulation. That will help you, of course, a lot. Now, aside from the legal obligation, like I said, this data register is a very useful tool because you're dealing with personal data of data subject. You have certain responsibility, and sometimes we don't know what we are doing. Entities don't know what they're doing with the personal data of data subjects, and that can lead to a lot of issues. And certainly now with GDPR and the focus we have now on personal data, I mean, times are different now. In previous years, there was less focus on this importance of keeping this data in a certain way to have an idea of what you're doing. A lot of companies were just processing data and that's it. Now that's not going to be possible anymore, and this register will give you the possibility to have a good mapping of what you are doing, why you are processing these data, who is responsible. So it's quite an important step and will help you in compliance with the obligations of GDPR. Now, Geert will discuss a bit more in detail the format of this register, because we're talking a lot about this register. How does it look like? And most importantly, what do you have to mention in it?
Yes, thank you, Laurent. The register, I got a lot of questions on what it needs to look like, what needs to be exactly in there, how should I do it. So we will try to, in this part, give a few examples and to define in a bit more detail on how you can tackle that one. At the end of this part, we will also discuss a short example, and we'll put that available for download as well afterwards. So first of all, it's important to note that there is no model or format that is obligatory for this records of processing activity. Basically, you can choose whatever you have or whatever you want to use. as long as it's in writing. And in writing means both digital or on paper are possible, but it would surprise me if you will still keep an old paper-based logbook for that. But it's possible if you want to. Actually, I think that's a very good thing because the authorities there give you the possibility to also expand your current inventories, like Laurent mentioned, software inventories, data inventories that you already have. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to keep a separate register for your company, and that you have the flexibility in defining that register in your own terms and to suit you what is the most practical in your organization. Secondly, that might be still open for a bit of discussion, but the GDPR at least does not put a requirement that it needs to be in a particular language. So also potentially not necessary to use the local language for the register within each country. Now, I say potentially, for example, in Belgium, the Belgian DPA has explicitly mentioned that it is allowed to, for example, use an English register for multinationals in Belgium, so we don't need to use Dutch, French, or German there. Of course, there might be other data protection authorities that might recommend or issue other rules. So that's something still to check, but at least on a GDPR level, it's not obligatory to maintain that from a legal point of view in a particular language or in the language of the DPA itself. Secondly, then, what needs to be in the registry? Well, there are a few mandatory fields. First of all, the name and the contact details of the controller, or if you're a processor, the processor. Then the purposes of the processing, and there I'll dive into a bit more detail later on. The categories of data subjects and personal data that you have. GDPR there doesn't say specifically how you need to categorize data or your data subjects. So you will have to come up yourself with a set of categories that are usable and in practice easy to work with. Then you have got the recipients to which you disclose your data. There I come back also in a bit more detail with a few examples. And then where applicable transfers to a third country, you need to mention that as well. So it's important to any transfers that you do outside the EU or outside towards a country which is not considered as adequate. There you will need to document that into your registry as well. And then the last one are the data retention times and the description of the technical and organizational measures you have. Now, there is an opening there because under GDPR it says where possible, data retention times and description of technical and organizational measures. How they will interpret the where possible, that's difficult to tell. I would at least recommend to include these into the registry by default, but you could do that using a reference or something else, which we will discuss also in a bit more detail now. Then if you look at the purposes for processing, in my opinion, just keep it short and to the point. You can write whole paragraphs on what is the purpose of processing for a certain process or application or activity. But I wouldn't go there. I would keep it relatively short, and I'll give a few examples. Employee administration, selection and hiring of qualified staff, professional career management and development, workplace monitoring, combating fraud or data breaches. Those are all short, simple examples of purposes that you could use in your registry. I don't think you need to put in more. You can if you want to, but please be aware you all have to maintain it as well. So if you start writing whole paragraphs to cover this one, then you will make your life just a bit more difficult for yourself. In terms of recipients, it's also an important one. It's a bit, for some people, not clear what does it mean, a recipient. Well, basically it's any body in terms of a natural legal person, an agency or another body to which you disclose the personal data. It doesn't matter if it's your own employees or a third party or a sub-processor. You will have to put it in the register if you disclose it to some other persons. There is only one exemption to this, and that is the public authorities who may receive personal data on or where you are obliged by law to provide them with certain data. So it's not necessary in terms of recipients to list, for example, the Public Finance Administration or the Social Security Services of the government, or etc., because those fall under this exemption. You are legally obliged to provide them with that data, so you don't have to register them as a recipient specifically anymore in your register. But all other categories of people with access to your data, you should put in there. Internally, this could mean your HR recruitment team, your IT support staff, IT administrators, management. So that kind of level of categories you will need to put in there somehow. That's basically the requirement. Then, in terms of retention times, we there, as I said, you can refer to your retention policy. So as discussed last time during the last webinar on retention, if you have defined your own retention schedule or policy already, the most easy option is here to just put a reference towards your detailed retention policy and schedule in the register, and to not go into further details inside your register. This will also avoid double maintenance, because if you enter it into your registry and you still maintain a separate policy on that one, then there might be discrepancies between those two that you will have to consolidate or manage if you don't pay attention. So don't make it too complicated. I would use a reference in this one. For the technical and organizational measures, there we recommend to put in a general description or a reference to such a description that applies for all of your data. You can put for every processing activity in detail all the measures you specifically take for that processing activity, but I think that would go too far, and it's also not the expectation. I would rather include in your registry a general description of all your security controls that you have in place. And then only, if relevant, still attach or document the specific measures that are relevant towards the processing activity itself. That way it will be easier to maintain your registry, and you don't have to repeat all kinds of security measures each time with each processing activity itself in your registry. Now, before we dive into an example of a registry, a few tips still with this. First of all, as already mentioned a few times, don't reinvent the wheel. I would start at maximum with what is already available, being it the things that you already put into the public registry at present, your existing data indexes, software asset registers you have, etc. Secondly, also don't go too deep in this. I sometimes get questions from customers or other partners asking for a full list of all data fields in applications. Yeah, you will end up with 800-900 or more fields to include. First. Secondly, it's subject to a lot of change. It's really difficult to keep that up to date and maintain. So don't go into that level of detail. Keep it on a process or an application level and stop there. That's my advice. And secondly, standardize your categories of data, and I would there really take a look at the recommendation in the template used by the Belgian DPA. The template itself is a bit complex, but the categories defined there and used are really useful as a starting point. I think there are about 20 to 30 categories that they use there. They're very much usable in practice. We use them ourselves as well, and I think it's a good start, so that you don't have to think yourself about how should I categorize all that data. And the fourth one then also, the last one, you get the mandatory fields, but also I would add a few useful fields to the register, even if they're not mandatory. I think they will help you a lot with the processing afterwards. A few examples: the legal base of processing for GDPR, you don't have to add that to your register. However, I would strongly recommend it because for each type of activity for which you're processing data, you need to know what your legal basis is. If you do not document it into your register, then where you're gonna save and document it? Then you need to put it somewhere else. So most practical, put it directly, immediately into the register, and then it's in one place and easy to consult. Also, an information owner, you will need to make sure that your register is kept up to date and that you know who to contact for what type of data or activity. So put an owner in there. And also very useful fields are the names of the IT applications supporting a process and the physical location of the data. In which data centers do you store that data? It's a question you often get from people, which you might also get from the Data Protection Authority. So I would add that at once. It's not such a big effort, and it will make your life a lot easier afterwards. Now, let's dive into an example. It's just a simple registry example. As I told you before, it can all take all kinds of different formats, and you can make it as complex or as extended as you want yourselves. So this is, in my opinion, one of the more simple register examples. For those organization people that don't have an idea yet on how to do it, you could use this as a basis. We will put it available in the form of an Excel document that you can use to complete. The first step is just containing the details of the entity for which you have established the registry. So the name and contact details of the legal entity, such as the name, the contact, the address, and the company number. Its representative, its legal representative, so one of the directors probably, or your CEO. And then the name and the contact details of the DPO, should you have one. That's something to include as basic information. Then you will have two tabs where you can complete then the actual registry, one for activities that you are doing as a controller, and one for the activities that you're doing as a processor. What is in there? We basically structured it around processes. So you will find first the title of the process there, and then the actual record for that process or activity. I just take a few, for example, compensation and benefits process within your HR department can be one, where you say the responsible for that one is your HR department, the director is the information owner. A few applications that support that process might be only one or multiple ones. In this case, we listed our Belgian payroll applications, being eBlocks Payroll, eBlocks HR, for providing input to that in our Flex income plan. Then the categories of data, and if you look at the categories of data, those are the ones that, for example, used by the Belgian DPA. So here we have identification information, financial characteristics such as a bank account number, personal characteristics being your age, your sex, etc. Family, because in most cases for doing your payroll calculation, you need to know a bit more detail on your family members that are under your responsibility. Then the most obvious one, profession, containing things like your wage categories, your function, etc., etc. Time registration, this is a big category, in fact. And then a social security number, which is also often needed to do the declarations towards the government. Categories, then, in this case, it's simple. We only said it says the Worx personnel, just as an example, but in some other processes, you will have to specify it a bit more. The purpose here is clear. I think payroll employee benefit management, and the legal basis for processing, we added as well, is the execution of a contract, namely the employment contract in this case, the legal obligation as an employer to foresee a payroll administration and declarations towards the government, and legitimate interest, of course, as well as a third one, because as an employer, you have all interest in having a fluent and efficient process in managing that one correctly. Then you can list all the categories of the recipients to which you disclose the data, if there is a transfer to a third country that applies, and if there is a joint data controller or not. In most cases, it won't be the case, but it can be in some cases that you have two data controls for the same process or set. The data retention period, as I said before, I would there just refer to a data retention schedule you have, and you can just put it into a clickable link there so that you can link directly into the retention schedule you made maybe, and then the physical location of the data where your data centers are in this case. So if you complete that for the most important processes in which you are processing personal data, you already have a good basis to start with. You can make it a lot more complex than this. There are quite a few other examples available on the internet if you Google or search a bit around this. But I would recommend to not go too far in the first stage, unless you already have a good system, of course. And typical processes that I would expect from an HR perspective are personnel administration, compensation and benefits, performance management, learning and development, recruitment. Those are all things that you would, by definition, if you have employees and people, would expect to have somewhere in your registry. And it's also not that difficult for a data protection authority to challenge that. So if you don't include recruiting, then it will likely be a question that pops up and say, do you have any recruitment system? Do you not store that somewhere? So just make sure those more evident processes are certainly in there and that is complete. And then the fourth tab we used is as in the example, is a general description of the technical and organizational measures to protect the data. The format I would suggest there is just a simple table with a few typical security domains and then the effective security practices you apply in a summary of that high-level description. You do not need to enter your whole security policy in there. It's just the overall overview of all the measures you have in place, such as, for example, I have a written security policy. I would suggest there to use the standard categories of the ISO 27001 standard of information security management. A lot of data protection authorities refer to that one. And those categories or domains of measures are very much recognized in the industry as a bit the main basis. So it makes it also easy to defend towards a data protection authority that all these measures are in place. So that as an example, we'll put the Excel available for download afterwards, so you can use that for those that don't have yet any register or any idea on how to construct that one. I'll pass back the words to Laurent shortly to wrap up this session.
Yeah, thank you, Gert. It's quite interesting. Well, if you ask me a humble opinion, the register on the slides looks easier to use than the one of the Data Privacy Commission, but that's of course completely off the record. And hopefully nobody from the Data Privacy Commission is listening now, because otherwise they will not answer my questions anymore. But as a conclusion, you have this new obligation. Don't make your life too difficult. Use what you already have inside the company. Maybe you already have a system. Maybe you already did a previous notification. All this kind of information you will be able to use for your register and for your new obligations. Think of a tool that is useful for your organization, something that is practical. Don't overdo it, like Gert said. Don't make too much description, but it needs to be useful. And you also need to think about the fact that you are accountable. That's all the principle of this, it's all the idea of this register. But that means also that there is an authority, and this authority may ask you to give an example of the register. So put yourself in their place when they will look at your register. Does it work? Do we understand it? So it needs to be something that is rational and which is understandable also for somebody who's not inside your organization. Now, last point and important one, the biggest challenge in this entire obligation and process is that you have to maintain your register, because of course everybody's talking about the GDPR, and it's almost May, so we have to do all kind of stuff and obligation. Oh, we need a register, so just look at the brilliant register that Geert mentioned on the slide, and that's it, it's over, tick the box, and now we can move on to something else. Now, it doesn't going to work like that. It's something dynamic. Like Geert said, that's, well, the data that you will process will evolve constantly, so you need to have people inside your organization who are owners of the information. So you assign people, you need to assign people who are the owners of the information, who are also responsible for that information. First important element in the framework of this dynamic element that is the register. Second point is also that you inside your management, you need to foresee a process whereby the updates of your system, of your register, are identified. Because if you have no updates, you will keep, in fact, your register like you completed day one, and then nobody took into account modifications, and then in fact the fact that you have a register doesn't help you, because you need to update your register. It's something that lives with your organization, that evolves constantly with the evolutions within your organization and your activities as a data controller or data processor. And finally, quite important also, I would recommend to organize like a yearly review of your system and of your register and of the content of your register. Make a review and foresee a validation processes at the end. And when it's validated, well, then you move on and you continue. And well, within each year, you do it over and over again, so you're sure that you are in line with the provisions of GDPR, and that if one day the data privacy authority is asking you well, some information about the register, or to have a look at your register, well, you will be in line and you don't have to worry about any infringements. That would be my last recommendations. Okay, that was the last slide about the register. I think we can now move on to the questions. Do we already have one question? Yeah, we see already one.
Yes, indeed. So please provide with your questions if you have one. The first one that pops up here is, to whom do we need to provide the data register? Well, basically GDPR only says that you need to provide it upon request to the data protection authorities, to your supervisory authority. So for the rest, it's an internal registry and document, and it's up to you to decide yourself to who that you want to disclose that register, or with whom that you share it. You might have questions from partners or data subjects for sharing it, but it's not needed. So it's up to you to define if you want to show that or not. The only obligation is with the data protection authority.
We have a second question. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Are there different obligation control processor? And indeed there are. Well, there is a slight difference if you look at the GDPR between what a controller has to mention in the register and what a processor has to mention in the register. Well, basically, the obligation of the processor, you could say it's a lighter version. So, for example, the processor of data is not obliged to mention anything about retention time or about categories of recipients. So the main obligation remain the same, but it's a bit a lighter version.
Then there is a question on, are there any penalties for not adhering to the obligation to keep a register? Yes, there certainly are. You fall into the lower end of the penalty categories that are defined under GDPR. So that means up to 10 million euros or 2% of your revenue potentially for not complying with the obligation of keeping a registry. So that's basically the sanctions, potential sanctions that are attached to this one. Then I also saw a question on, is an HR manager, a processor, or controller, or both? Well, in most cases, as an HR department, you are the one who's collecting the data of your employees and are determining the goals in the process for which you collect that data and to whom you disclose it and with whom you work with to process that data. So you are really in control, meaning typically the HR department or the company itself for its own HR activities will be the controller for that data. So you will not be able to easily put yourself as a processor on that level. Unless you are a service provider who is active in the HR world, such as we are, we typically then serve as a processor for you as a controller.
Yeah, we also have a question about retention time. What is the, if there are any rules about retention time? Well, of course, about retention time, you need to mention, well, like we said, you can refer to retention policy. Are there any rules? Well, it depends a bit of the kind of data. If somebody is leaving the company, and it was a bit the subject of our previous webinar. I mean, if somebody is leaving the company, you can face legal claims. That's something you cannot determine in advance. So you have a justification to keep this human resource data for a period that is well linked to the legal statutory notice period. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think also that Data Privacy Commission had some recommendation about regarding retention period for the data that you mentioned in your register. And Gert, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they mentioned something that even if you are not processing the data anymore, in your register, you can keep them for a period of 5 years. So they have the possibility to ask your register and to check also for previous processing. But what I most of the time recommend with regard to retention time is to look at the statutory limitation periods. If you are facing a potential claim, and that means statutory retention periods, don't look only at the civil one, but especially the criminal ones, which can be longer.
Okay, then there is a question on how much information you need to give on a joint controller or a processor. I think the minimum you need to include, I think, is the name of the organization, address or an email address, contacts at least, and to avoid any confusion, if you have that available, I would also include the company number, the registered company number, typically, to avoid misunderstandings between different companies. if you know the name and if it's available, you could also enter the name of the data protection officer of the joint controller or the processor. But more than that is not needed. You could also typically do that by reference. If you have another system, like for example, if the data controllers are all your customers, or another list of companies that you keep somewhere in another system, you can make a reference towards, for example, your CRM system or towards another inventory system or application in which you keep the details of all the companies. So in practice, it will not be easy if you have, like us, for example, 60,000 customers. We're not going to maintain the list of customers in the registry directly. We will refer towards our CRM system, and where we can easily provide a report and pull a report on who they exactly are. So that's also certainly a possibility and should be sufficient.
We also have a question about sanctions. Did you already?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, yeah, it says the UK has sometimes foreseen additional fields. It might be that on top of the strictly legally obliged fields on GDPR, and in some countries there are recommendations from the data protection authorities to include more. These are recommendations. That's not directly law, so it's a bit open still for advice and interpretation, unless there is a specific requirement in a local law to add more. But that's at the moment not yet the case, I think. But like also the Belgian DPA has also included the recommendations to add more than pure the mandatory fields. It's all possible, I would say, but if you have the time and the effort to do that, but I would focus now on the mandatory categories and the ones that are really added value and useful on a short-term notice for you as an organization, because you could easily lose yourself in all those details in the registry if you start adding fields and yeah, think about the maintenance afterwards. So the more complex, the more fields you add, you will all have to keep it up to date. So you make just your life a bit more difficult then. But that doesn't mean that it's not, if you're able to maintain it and you have a good system for it, yeah, please, of course, feel free to add more. And check the guidance of your local data protection authority if it's really more that is needed or not.
To come back to the UK specifically, I heard from my colleagues in the UK that their data privacy authority tends to have a bit more tends to be a bit more strict in a certain sense in their recommendation than GDPR. So it's possible that in the UK you will have to foresee a bit more information than for example, in Belgium, with regard to their recommendations. So they have the tendency to have a bit larger view on the obligations of this data register.
There is also still a question on how detailed do you have to register? Is identification data enough, or do you need to add name, a social security number, etc.? No, identification data as a category, for example, is enough. So you do not need to list all kinds of fields and more details behind that. That would make it far too complex. So it's only the idea that you register the categories of data you hold, but not really the detailed data below that. So identification data, financial characteristics, etc., that's enough.
And we also have one that you already did, the one about recruitment. So we also have a question about recruitment. Well, that's also yeah, it's one of the categories that you mentioned in your register. Aim of the processing of these is recruitment. So that's one of a category that you can mention. And about the retention time, that is, well, for these kind of categories, there are some authorities that are quite strict with the retention time on material that you get from candidates. So normally it's as long as necessary for this specific processing activity. But recruitment is clearly one category that you can mention in your register.
Then the last and final question is on do you need to break down IDs or processes if you have, for example, different recipients or different elements in the process? There's no golden rule for it. It's a bit up to your own interpretation on that level. But I would say if the process is well defined and if it has the same owner, because if you all have multiple owners for the same process or sub elements of the process, then it might be better to break that down a bit. You do not need to break it down to the level that you have a line for each recipient or for each subcategory. That would go a bit too far in my personal opinion. But I would rather focus on the information owners, on the process flow and applications supporting it. If you have 5 applications supporting different elements of the process, you might break that down in 5 sub-processes in your register if that's easier to maintain. And if they have different information owners or application owners, etc., then that would make sense. On the other hand, if they're all very much related and apply to the same processes and the same type of data is processed, you could also still combine that a bit. It's a bit a judgment call with each case where you have to balance, I think, the completeness of the register versus having too much detail and no longer being able to maintain everything correctly. So for each company that's different. It's difficult to give one rule in that. It also depends on the resources and the process you have already in place for maintaining such a register and for keeping that up to date. So it's a bit to be defined case by case, but I would certainly be, if you do not yet have something that's as a process or a register to start from and which is already well maintained, then I would be careful to start with too much detail. Better start high level and afterwards add to that if feasible and deemed necessary, than to go too far from the beginning and no longer being able to maintain and keep up to date the registry. So that was the session of today, where we zoomed in a bit on the data registry. I hope it was very useful for you and gave you a bit of glimpse on what's possible. We want to thank everyone for joining. The webinar will also be available to be viewed again at our website, sdworx.com/GDPR/downloads. And if we didn't get the chance to answer all of your questions because we were not able to go through all of them, then you can still email us directly and we'll get back to you. Do follow our further countdown webinar series, which aims to guide you month by month until the GDPR D-Day in May. So our next webinar will take place the end of March. That's the 29th of March, the last Thursday of March. Please follow us also on Twitter and LinkedIn and stay tuned for further information. Thank you very much, and very much good luck with implementing the obligation to keep your register.